Hi, everyone. You are watching the Asian American Herald, a new media network. The show is being aired via live stream on Facebook, and a recording will be available afterwards at our Facebook page, Asian American Herald. My name is Himanee Gupta-Carlson, and I'm a professor at Empire State College in Saratoga Springs, New York, as well as a community-based farmer and a writer. So I want to open tonight, as I usually do, with a weekly tribute to the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, who are the original caretakers of much of upstate New York, which is where the Asian American Herald is based. And in making this tribute, I acknowledge myself as a settler on the lands, and I thank the Haudenosaunee for providing shelter. So our guest tonight is Saatvik Athulwalia, a digital strategist committed to the organizing of progressive Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Saatvik grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, and currently resides in Austin, Texas, which is a little bit warmer than it is in upstate New York, though he's wearing a jacket and I'm wearing a sweater, so you can figure out what to do about that. Anyway, Saatvik has worked with numerous business and community-based organizations, and he's currently affiliated with Progress Texas, which is a media organization dedicated to generating messages, news releases, and articles that support progressive changes in Texas state and U.S. federal policy. So, Saatvik, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much, Himanee. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, and it's a thrill to have you as well, and to talk about politics and the possibility of Texas going blue.
Yeah, it's possible.
So, yeah, anything. Well, I'm not going to say anything's possible because we want it to be like it's imminently possible. But anyway, let's start first with yourself. Can you just tell us a little bit about where you grew up and how your present career took shape?
Yeah, sure. So, my parents came from Delhi and Jaipur, landed in Boston to get their master's and MBA at Boston University, and they fell in love with Boston. So I was born in Boston, went to school for my bachelor's at Boston University, and I basically lived there until 2016 when I moved to Philadelphia because my wife, or fiance at the time, was getting her medical degree at Drexel University. And we showed up in Austin because she became a resident here. So right now she's a pediatric resident. And that, we opened a letter one day and ended up here in Austin. As for how I got here, I had started a nonprofit when I was right out of school. And the way we were getting processing payments for it was through a third party. And then that third party stole all of our revenue. So we were like, well, what do we do? And we found a law firm in New York to represent us up to a point. And they said, hey, we believe in what you're doing, but ultimately we're going to have to, it's going to cost you more money to get back what was stolen from you than is worth it. So, I think our legal advice is to kind of like drop it. So we did. And that's kind of when I got into organizing. Because I said, if the legal routes don't lead to like a really good organization, like getting what justice is, the laws need to be changed to make it more accessible. So I worked on Ed Markey's first editorial campaign. From there, I worked on a number of other campaigns, managed some, ran for office, held office for a little while. And then I ended up going into the private sector after I lost my biggest campaign, where I learned a lot about like digital marketing, did some more digital marketing work in Philadelphia. And when I moved here to Austin and my wife had a job, I was like, well, time to go back into politics and like get back to my roots. And that's how I got into Progress Texas and this kind of work, with progressive values in the state.
Okay, that's really interesting. And it leads me to ask you a couple more questions.
Sure.
What did you study in college? And then can you tell us a bit about this nonprofit that you formed?
Yeah, so I studied international relations in college. My mom had done large global nonprofit work with workforce development around the world. I was like, you know what? My mom is awesome. I want to do exactly what she's doing. Unfortunately, or actually I think fortunately, I really focused on something else while I was in college, which was I was running a Bollywood dance team called Boston University Jalwa. And we kind of like became, I think we were a pretty good team. We went to a couple of national championships. And so really what I learned was how do you organize, create a vision for an organization and execute on it, which I think helped me a lot more than anything I studied per se. And then as far as the nonprofit, my mom had started it, and she developed cancer in 2012 when I graduated. So I kind of like stepped in with a friend of mine to do she was still the strategic vision behind what that nonprofit would do. It was called Youth Trade. And my friend and I kind of managed how do we actually execute on that. And Youth Trade's purpose was to help young entrepreneurs between the ages of 18 and 35 kind of get their products from their mind into retail stores. So our major partners were Whole Foods and Nordstrom. And a lot of the entrepreneurs we worked with got into the shelves on these stores across the nation, and are doing really well today because of some of the work that we were able to do, helping them get access to retail space.
So that's so interesting because it's a divergence from politics, but it is political in some ways.
Yeah. How do you get representation even in the entrepreneurial world for young people?
Yeah, we talk about that a lot in the kind of the small scale farming world that I run in. It's one of the many worlds I run in. And, one of the issues here, particularly in New York, is that there's very few farmers of color, and there's even fewer farmers of color who own their own land. I'm one of a very small handful, and I've just been thinking, how do we change that? And it's political, but it's also, it's really about getting people up to a state of economic parity.
Yeah. I mean, I think I can relate to that idea of not having people who look like you in the spaces you work in, because definitely in politics, like when I started, organizing when I was, 2013, I was usually the only Indian person or Asian person in any given room. And luckily things have changed drastically since then.
Yeah. Indians and other Asian Americans I was overwhelmed by how organized and how active they were in the past season of elections, and how they continue to be, by necessity almost. So what is a digital strategist? That's been my burning question since I've been preparing for this interview. So what does a digital strategist do?
So it can mean a lot of different things. It can be very narrow. So at my previous job, I was just a social media strategist, and it was basically saying, what are the business goals and how do we execute on them like in a social media space? But at Progress, I kind of wear many hats. I manage the website. So how do you make sure that when a user or a citizen gets to the website, they're able to figure out, how do I learn about whatever topic I'm really passionate about? It involves like running ad campaigns. So during the 2020 elections, we ran massive ad campaigns in San Antonio and like Southern Texas to try and get out voters and hopefully make them, encourage them to vote for progressive candidates. It means running a massive email campaign, or rather email program, where on a weekly basis, we're reaching out to over 150,000 people talking about progressive narratives. And in addition, it involves, how do you use social media, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, all these things to, again, like build a vision of what a progressive Texas looks like, and kind of paint a narrative of like, what do progressive values really mean? What are we for, not what are we just against?
Yeah. And so what does a progressive Texas look like?
It means that we're not the most uninsured state in the nation, right? It means that we're able to get justice for trans kids. It means that reproductive access, such as abortion rights, aren't constantly under attack. The space that, like where I live, if you go a little bit to the east, there's the closest abortion clinic is over the state border, which means that unless you're relatively well off to access abortions, you're in trouble, right? You're not able to access that. It means voting rights that don't curtail our ability to vote, but rather innovate, so we can say, let's vote by mail. Let's have 24-hour voting locations. How do we make it easier to access democracy, not how do we make it harder to do so? And I think most importantly for our state, it's, Texas is already leading in a lot of ways for wind and solar energy. How do we encourage that instead of discouraging it?
Yeah. So it's a lot of different issues on a lot of different levels. And I'm kind of curious how the campaigns you were involved with last year, voter registration, filling out census forms, raising money, gathering signatures to support voting by mail. How do those come together? And then how do those actually support this kind of multi-tiered vision that you've just laid out for us so beautifully?
Sure. So I guess vote by mail was the first thing that we really moved on. We moved on it almost immediately as the pandemic hit, because we knew that Texas is one of the hardest states to vote in, and it'll just get even harder with a pandemic of like this scale. So a lot of that was, through working with a few partners to promote it. It was through using some social media campaigns to get it in front of people. And the goal with this petition, so a lot of times petitions, you sign it and that's it. It doesn't go anywhere. When we run petitions at Progress Texas, whenever you sign it, a letter is being sent to your elected official. So in this case, we were sending emails to the Secretary of State. And what we were able to do by sending her over 7,000 emails was make her respond to our ask to expand vote by mail. When she responded, it allowed our partners who are in more maybe like legal spaces to enact lawsuits to try and expand it. Unfortunately, we weren't able to win those lawsuits, but we were still able to create the language and the environment for them to happen in the first place. When you're talking about the census, it was about understanding how do different AAPI communities need to be messaged to understand why the census is valuable. But more importantly, because of the kind of fear Donald Trump created around the census, your data will not be shared with someone. It is anonymized. ICE cannot access the data that the Social Security Administration is getting. So how do you overcome that? And in a lot of AAPI cases, we're so diverse, there's a mistrust of government.
Yeah.
So why should you trust the government to give them this information? And what's the benefit? Like a lot of Asian Americans are saying, how will this help my business? How will this help my kids' school? How will this help the roads? Well, explaining that when you have a higher census count, more federal dollars will get pulled in, will get funneled into your area. It's like, oh, okay, so this is like free money almost. And all I have to do is get myself and my family and my friends and my community to fill out a very simple form. And the end result is millions of dollars over 10 years. It's quite compelling.
Yeah. And were people buying the message?
They did. So in 2019, when the census started its campaign to find local partners, they said that AAPIs would be Asian American Pacific Islanders, which we call AAPI for short, would be the most difficult group to engage. And what we ended up here in Central Texas is we had the highest rate of self-response, and we had a small team doing it. So having that great result was very gratifying.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. How big is the Asian American Pacific Islander community in Texas, or the population? It's multiple communities.
Yeah. I'm forgetting the exact numbers, but I do know that we're the fastest growing population in Texas.
Okay.
And even more so in Central Texas, which is around Austin. So, we're growing quickly. We want to get heavily engaged, and we want a voice at the table.
Yeah. And to what extent is the population of the Asian and Pacific Islander population in Texas, new immigrants, non-citizens versus kind of citizens as well as U.S. born?
So, that's a great question. And I think it's pretty evenly split, right? I think one thing that's missed when we talk about Asian Americans or Asians in general is how diverse our backgrounds are.
Yeah.
So you might have, I know from having family that there were Indians in Texas 20, 30 years ago, obviously even earlier than that, because they came to work at NASA and whatnot. Today, though, we're seeing also there's a lot of refugees coming from different parts of Asia. There's more working class immigrants coming. So the experience is very diverse. And from the work that I've done, the big populations are Vietnamese, Chinese, Japanese, and Indian.
Okay. And are they primarily in urban areas, or where do you find the communities?
I think it's definitely urban, and then the surrounding suburban areas. So, Houston has a huge population, obviously. It is the big cities. So Austin is growing because we're having more tech jobs coming. But Houston has always had a really large AAPI population. That's why the two AAPIs or so that are in the State House, they're both from the Houston area. And Dallas has also had a lot because of the energy sector there and having lots of engineers coming in to kind of figure out where is the oil.
Yeah. I had an internship, a newspaper internship. I was a newspaper reporter in my first career.
Yeah.
And way back in 1985, I had an internship at the Fort Worth Star Telegram.
Wow.
And yeah, and it was so interesting because I did have some contact with the Indian community in Dallas due to a family friend being there.
Yeah.
But it was very, almost intimidatingly white from my memories. And I had been looking forward to kind of connecting with Latinas and Mexicans in Texas, but I found that it was kind of like it was hard. I just felt, the environment was very, very tough in Texas, and I don't know, has that changed or what's different?
So there's definitely spaces where you'll find it be very white. 2 days ago, I went to the Capitol to testify on a House resolution to condemn anti-Asian bigotry and racism and violence. And it was my first time to really be in the Capitol with other folks there. And it was pretty homogenous, right? It was mostly older white men who were there. But I do think, and this is some of the work that we're trying to do on the ground, there is a big effort to see how do we build broader coalitions with African Americans, with Latinos, within the AAPI community because we're so diverse, and with working class folks, because really to make a more progressive Texas that really serves the interests of most of the people, it's not going to happen by just one population working. It's going to happen by building a broader coalition.
Yeah. Are you all working with the issues at the border? That's just such a huge, huge issue nationally, unfortunately, beginning in the Obama administration, but really intensifying under Trump and, continuing as we're watching Biden to see what he'll do.
We haven't worked on it too much. The administration, I think, is still trying to figure out exactly what the approach is. What I've understood is that the biggest issue is a lack of funding to create safe spaces for those who are crossing. Deporting people to dangerous situations is not a good win. It's not a good thing that I think anyone really wants.
Yeah.
But it's equally bad to have adults and children in really dangerous spaces where there's unhygienic, where they're where COVID can run rampant. So I think there's no perfect solution, but I think a better solution would be if the spaces where these immigrants are being housed are fully equipped with good staff who can take care of their needs and help them understand our immigration system with lots of translators and doctors and all that kind of stuff, so that they are at the very least very healthy and able to thrive as they make the process into being coming to the U.S.
Yeah. Just such a, I don't know. I have not been down there, and I've kind of been advised that not to go down there, but it just seems like such a really, really difficult situation. And it's another way that Asian Pacific Americans, as well as other people of color, have been so visible in the past several months. We've got Asians being accused as being spreaders of the coronavirus. We've seen a lot of verbal harassment, and we've seen elderly people being shoved in the streets. And then we had the shootings in Atlanta at the Asian American Spa. And then more recently, these shootings in Indianapolis where, theoretically, Sikh workers were not being targeted, but when a facility employs 90% Sikh, how could you, how do you differentiate? And so I don't know, media, and you're so involved with it, is very powerful. And I'm wondering how campaigns by right-wing organizations are encouraging and maybe organizing even toward this kind of violence, and how organizations like yours, like Progress Texas, are responding.
So I go on Reddit a lot, and I think there is a right-wing element that is trying to foment this, and they're doing it in two ways. One is the more obvious way, which Donald Trump said it first: China virus, Kung flu, these dog whistles, which even if they're dog whistles which don't seem racist, but they actually encourage this kind of negative view of people who are Asian. The other thing I see happening a lot is this conflation of like individuals who might be Black or Latino committing some of these crimes with a larger like Black versus Asian conflict, which I don't think exists. The reality is that it is a larger narrative which is causing people to do these kinds of things. Obviously, like people who do attacks like this, whatever your background is, you should be held accountable. But conflating these attacks as like individual African Americans or individual white people or individual Latinos as saying it's a larger race issue, I think is really disingenuous and pretty harmful, because from my opinion, the only way to really tackle this head on is to build, again, a coalition to say, we're not going to stand for this white supremacist narrative that's othering us, that's devaluing our lives. I think in addition, there are folks who want to look at this as a one-off trend, but the reality is that anti-Asian sentiments have been part of America for a long time, right? Yeah. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the war in Vietnam, the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. And there are folks who might argue that some of that was justified because of whatever, but the reality is that 20 years later, do we still need to be occupying Asian land and killing Asian people? And the answer is no. Yeah. So it has to be looked at as a larger trend that's like devaluing Asian lives both here in America and also around the world, if we're really going to tackle it successfully to end it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, you've just brought in so many other things to think about. And, you know, I think it's really important to really look at that larger narrative and to realize the impact that that's had on the American psyche for so many decades, couple centuries almost, and how it's, you know, not resolved. Mm-hmm. It's not resolvable. Excuse me.
No problem.
But on the opposite side, in a way, there's been such an incredible rise in Asian Pacific American political participation. I was working on a paper for a conference and found that South Asian American media reported at least 35 Desi candidates in the November election, and many of them were first-time candidates. And a lot of people were also attributing the flip in such battleground states as Georgia to Asian American political participation. So tell me about that. What's your take on all these issues?
So I think it's good to see this representation of various Asian identities in these spaces, right? I think it's needed. It needs to be there because our voice is very important. The way we thought about it when we were organizing here in Texas is that, you know, having the AAPI vote in any given district might not be the thing which you like count on to win, right? We're not large enough yet, I don't think, to be a base of support. But there's enough of us in enough places that we can be the person who tips an election in, you know, one way or the other. And you know, I had friends who moved to Georgia during the second part of the election, the runoff, to organize AAPIs, and they did phenomenal work, and the turnout was really great. Actually, even here in Central Texas, the overall turnout increased by about 34% for voters, but the AAPI turnout went up by 71%.
Wow.
So I think we're ready to see ourselves as part of this nation, part of this experiment, and not be othered anymore. And a big part of that is registering to vote and the turning out.
Yeah. So Asian Americans have been in the U.S. for a while, obviously. I'm going to be doing a little stereotyping because I do acknowledge that the community is incredibly diverse, but there is a very large core of Asian Americans, and particularly South Asian Americans, who are very well educated, very well off, and you know, pretty well placed in society. And I'm kind of wondering what is prompting this community to actually crawl out of their comfortable, maybe their economically comfortable, safe spaces and get organized now. What they could have done this, you know, I don't know, 20 years ago, but they're doing it now. And I'm wondering what has been the catalyst that's really pushing that change.
I think part of it is understanding that just having wealth won't protect you from some of the negative consequences of bad leadership.
Yeah.
I think a perfect example is the handling of the pandemic, right? Being rich and living in your, like a nice house in a suburb, you will still get COVID and you
Yeah.
can still die from COVID. And a lack of adequate governmental response to COVID is a clear indicator that like there's other things beyond having a wealthy family and like lots of education. Like you need to have a functioning government that can say, okay, we need a national response. And here's the reality. We're the wealthiest country in the world.
Yeah.
And we've had one of the worst responses to COVID, if not the worst. And it's getting better now with like this amazing vaccine rollout. We hit 200 million vaccine doses, I think, today, which is phenomenal. And the vaccine would have taken time to get no matter what. But in the interim, while we were trying to fight it and keep deaths down, keep cases down, we could have used a different kind of leadership. And I think Daisy's and like the Asians are talking about, and I think Asians in general see that and say, man, we deserve better. And I think even more poignantly, in a lot of communities, it's Asians who are dying the most. So I saw a stat, and I might get it wrong, but it was, there's a lot of nurses who are, I think it was Vietnamese or Filipino.
Filipino, Vietnamese,
Yeah, and so I think what I'm talking about, where their death rates were exponentially high, and that's a cause of bad leadership.
Yeah.
And we don't want our Filipino brothers and sisters to die because of like bad leadership. So we need to vote for new leadership.
Yeah.
And I think, we're seeing that there are larger and larger problems, climate change, for example, which can't get tackled by wealth. You need to have a concerted effort to tackle these problems. And I think that's a big part of seeing this rise in Asian participation at like different levels of government.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of also, I'm thinking about the Filipino nurses, disaggregating that Asian Pacific American data so you could actually see the impact of COVID by community also revealed so many structural imbalances in society. Like, what are the conditions, for instance, that gave rise to so many nurses from the Philippines and Vietnam being right on the front lines, being those essential workers who were most exposed?
I think that it is essential to disaggregate our data. When you roll Asians up together in one bucket, we look like a model minority, right? Yeah. But the reality is that a lot of our communities are suffering because they don't have access to resources, partially because they're rolled up together with different populations. But from my experience, Cambodian refugees who live in Austin have a very different life than someone from India who came here with 2 master's degrees, right? It's not even comparable. And we need to take those things into account, because the other problem is you're disenfranchising those communities because they're seeing, okay, just because I'm Asian, I'm not getting the resources I need because this other Asian is making it, we're being seen differently. So if we're going to get the right help for the right communities, we need to disaggregate that data.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to shift. We're starting to run close to our time. So I just want to shift and talk a little bit about Texas again.
Sure.
And there's a couple things I wanted to ask you about, and I'll just ask them together and you can kind of respond accordingly. First, Texas just has such a reputation for being run by an old boys network. We've got the Bush family down there and, so I'm kind of curious about that reputation. To what extent is it true and how is it changing? And on the other side, I'm also really curious about the Howdy Modi event that took place, I think in 2018 or 2019. And, what did that say about Texas's South Asian American community? So I'll throw both of those at you and do what you want with them.
Sure. So regarding Howdy Modi, I didn't know much about it. Like I was in Austin at the time, but I believe it was in Houston, and the folks in my circle didn't speak about it too much. I'm not a fan, so there's that. Regarding what we can do, I think there's a misinterpretation that Texas is hard red. I think a big part of it is we're really a non-voting state. So we were like 46th in voter turnout. And voter suppression always impacts the same communities, the folks that would be voting Democratic, more progressive. And what we saw in 2020, a lot of folks were disappointed with Texas, but the reality is that we did a really good job. We've been closing that gap in presidential elections every year. And this year, I think, we could have had it, but Trump found a new group of voters in South Texas who turned out. So I'm very confident that in the next few years, we'll see a blue Texas in a national election. It's just gonna mean that we need to keep, organizing, doing grassroots work, and building coalitions so that we can, get out the vote.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, often the blueness starts, or the redness, depending on which way the state is going. It starts kind of at the local level where you've got candidates who are Democrat or again Republican being elected to office, and then those candidates use their clout to kind of organize others and organize more, and so the kind of the power starts to rise up through the ranks. And so, along those lines, I actually had the opportunity last fall to interview Pooja Sethi, who was a candidate for Austin City Council. And, it seemed like she did relatively well as a first-time candidate, and she got a lot of endorsements in a lot of newspapers. But, she was in a crowded field and she finished third. And I'm wondering, how do you all kind of reach out with these kind of unsuccessful candidates so that they don't get discouraged, and that their constituents, the people who supported them, don't get discouraged, so that they try to run again?
Well, so Pooja is actually a really close friend and a mentor of mine. We just worked on a large Stop Asian Hate rally where over 1,000 folks showed up.
Oh, awesome. Okay.
When I think about Pooja, she ran because I think people called her to run because she's an amazing community activist. And not winning, I've met many candidates over the past 10 years. A lot of them run because they have an ego about winning, and when they don't win, they leave it all behind and they go and do something else. That's not Pooja. Pooja ran because she was called to, but today she's still doing that same organizing work in wonderful, beautiful ways. And so, I don't think she's discouraged. I think there's a lot of things that happen at the local level. So in Austin, there's a few really wealthy communities in one part of the city that account for the majority of donations and the majority of votes in every election. And it keeps a lot of more diverse candidates out because there's a sort of kingmaker kind of aspect to it. And the only way to overcome that is only happen by building broader coalitions and really showing people why they need to vote. I don't think progressives are always the best at showing what is in it for our voters, to say, here's a vision of what we can build. But through the work I do at Progress Texas, and thus the work that I do in my community here in Austin, we're constantly trying to show, here's why voting progressive is the right thing to do. You want to live a better life in a safer community with better education and better access to healthcare, vote progressive. And it doesn't happen overnight. And there's also a lot of folks who try and co-opt the term progressive. And then do non-progressive things. So there's a lot that we're working against, but people like Pooja and so many other activists that I work with, we're slowly, creating that change and creating that feeling of what's possible. And I think we'll start seeing, a lot of impact in the next few years.
Okay, well, I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to that night when I shouldn't actually always state my political affiliations, but I'm looking forward to that election night when I'm watching MSNBC on my laptop or my computer or my TV, if I ever actually get one again, and watching that state go with those crosses, that red or blue, red or blue, red or blue to blue. I'm going to wait for that day, and I'm going to expect you to be a part of it.
Oh, 100%. I intend to.
Okay, well, on that note, I'm going to just wrap things up, and thank you, Saatvik, for joining us tonight and for this really interesting conversation. And thank you, everyone else, for being here as well. I'm Himanee Gupta-Carlson, and I've been speaking with digital strategist Saatvik Athulwalia. The Asian American Herald is a Facebook-based news media outlet dedicated to discussing topics and building community among Asian Americans in New York and well beyond, as our guest tonight is an evidence of. So Please continue to send us your story ideas and look for a recording of this show on our Facebook page. So have a good evening, and I'll see you all again next Thursday.
Thanks so much. Have a good
Thank
one.
you. Yeah, have a good evening.